Just after midnight, on the morning of November 16, 2003, a firebomb tore through the center of the Holocaust Education Center in Terre Haute, Indiana. Much of the building's interior was incinerated in the blaze. Unknown quantities of historical memorabilia, including the personal belongings of Holocaust survivors, were destroyed. By the time fire crews arrived, it was already too late.
The fire was in the middle of the building. It took us about 35 to 40 minutes to bring the fire under control. On the north side of the building, the door had been knocked out prior to our arrival. At this time, the fire is under investigation.
This museum was the life work of Eva Kor, former victim of Auschwitz concentration camp, and of the so-called Angel of Death, Dr. Joseph Mengele. Eva had built this education center from the ground up, with her own resources. And on the day after the bombing, television news reporters gathered here in Terre Haute to cover the story.
This is Action 10 News, WTHI.
A little piece of history is lost tonight.
Fire ripped through the Candles Holocaust Museum in Terre Haute just after midnight last night. There is evidence of arson. Police are treating the case as a hate crime.
Eva was asked by reporters how she first learned of the attack.
The policeman said, "Mrs. Kor, I need to inform you that there is a fire at the museum." I said, "A fire?" Everything is gone. They have destroyed everything.
On the walls of the museum, the arsonist has sprayed the words, "Remember Timothy McVeigh." 2 years before the bombing, domestic terrorist Timothy McVeigh was executed here in Terre Haute. You may remember McVeigh as the man who drove a van full of explosives into a federal building in Oklahoma City, killing 168 people, including 19 children. This was the kind of hate that Eva was confronted with on that day. She was saddened, of course, but not impressed. When asked how she felt about the bombing, she said simply, "I've had better days, but I've also had worse days." And she was right. As a Holocaust survivor, she'd had worse days, by every imaginable standard. After learning of the bombing and of Eva's story, I drove to Terre Haute, about 3 hours south of Wabash, to learn more about the Candles Holocaust Education Center, and also of the life of this incredible woman. So why don't we start with you telling me your name and your position here?
Yeah, Troy Fears, and I am Executive Director at Candles Holocaust Museum and Education Center, located in Terre Haute, Indiana.
And you mentioned that we are in Terre Haute, Indiana, and I'm sure you get asked this a lot. Why is there a Holocaust Museum Center here in central Indiana?
Yeah, we do get that a lot. And we are Indiana's only Holocaust museum, founded a little over 27 years ago by a Holocaust survivor by the name of Eva Kor, who was a twin, and she and her sister survived Auschwitz and survived experiments done on them at Auschwitz by Dr. Joseph Mengele. Long story short, Eva ends up in Terre Haute and marries another Holocaust survivor by the name of Mickey Kor, who was in Terre Haute and had gone to Israel on vacation and had a blind date with Eva. And they actually got married after 2 weeks, if you can believe that. And then he was a pharmacist here in Terre Haute. So he brought her back, obviously, with him after they got married. And they lived and worked in Terre Haute for many years. And that's how Indiana's only Holocaust museum ends up in Terre Haute.
So what led her to opening this museum here?
She founded Candles, again, about 27 years ago. And Candles is actually an acronym. It's for Children of Auschwitz Nazi Deadly Lab Experiment Survivors. So it's a long acronym. And just so people know, we do sell candles, but we don't make candles. I get that question a lot too. Do you have bulk vanilla candles? No, we don't make candles.
I actually bought one of the candles they do sell. It's a custom scent, designed for the museum by a local manufacturer, and has one of those wooden wicks that crackles as it burns. Most importantly, it's a great way to support this museum and its mission. Anyway, back to Eva.
She founded the organization Candles, again, about 27 years ago, in honor of her sister, Miriam. Her sister, Miriam, had some health issues, and Eva donated a kidney to Miriam in 1987. And it was during that process they found out that Miriam, her twin sister, kidneys didn't grow past the age of 10, which was the age that they were at in Auschwitz and that they were doing experiments on them at that time. And it was during that process of Eva donating her kidney, the doctors said, hey, if you could find other Holocaust survivors, other twins, particularly from Auschwitz, maybe we can help out and try to find out what experiments were done on you, the twins in general. And so that's what the quest kind of was for Eva, to start this museum and start looking for Holocaust survivor twins. And they actually ended up finding about 122 twins that were still alive at the time. Again, this was back in 1987 or so. And they were never able to find out what experiments were done on those twins. They were never able to find any documentation from Dr. Mengele and his experiments, but they were able to have reunions for those twins and able to talk about what they had gone through, which was obviously very traumatic. And it was a good experience for them, I think, to be able to get together and to be able to talk about their experiences.
I'd like to go back to prior to Eva's life, before she went into Auschwitz with her sister and her family. But before we get into that, I wanted you to tell me about the room that we were just in, where you could actually see Eva, because Eva passed away. Is that right?
Correct. Eva passed away July 4th of 2019. So about 3.5 years ago, at the age of 85. And so what we have here at the museum, and it's a relatively small museum, but we do have a very cool interactive exhibit. It's called The Dimensions in Testimony. And what it is, in a nutshell, is basically you can have a conversation with Eva. And Eva did this back in 2017. So a couple of years before she passed away, she went out to California and was able to do this. It's basically a hologram, and she was asked thousands of questions. And so you can now ask Eva any kind of questions from her time before Auschwitz to her time during and after, and just hear all kinds of responses. It's a way, obviously, to interact with the Holocaust survivor. And I tell people that it's similar to asking Siri or Alexa. It's all word recognition, and it's a very cool technology, and we're very proud and happy to have it here at our museum. It's one of the highlights of people coming in here to the museum. They not only hear Eva's story, they actually get to hear and see Eva via the television, but this interactive theater, it's very cool.
When you come into the theater, there's a life-size screen at the front of the room, and an image of Eva projected on it. The room seats maybe 30 people and would be ideal for school groups. It's been almost 80 years now since World War II, and we lose more Holocaust survivors every day. Among those who do survive, many were too young to fully grasp what was happening in the moment. Many others, very understandably, would rather not talk about it. Being able to engage with a Holocaust survivor in the way this theater allows us to do is a rare and precious opportunity. That was something that I did not expect when I walked in, that we were going to hear from her. You walked into that room and there she is, just sitting there moving. I was just like, what's happening?
Yeah, it's a great educational tool, and it is available online, and it's great we get emails all the time from teachers all across the country that use this and use Eva's story to help tell the story of the Holocaust or help teach it. And so it's very moving and gratifying when you get those kind of emails that Eva is still making an impact on students all over the country. And that was one of her big things, in that when she was, as she got older, she would speak to more and more groups and really related to students, both high school and kind of the middle-age groups. They really gravitated towards her story, and she was able to impact and to speak to thousands of students all over the country. She would travel and give speeches, and to this day, we get, again, emails or even people coming to the museum saying that they saw Eva speak 10 years ago and what an impact that her story had on them.
One of the best things about this theater is the fact that you can access it online. You can ask Eva just about anything. She'll tell you about soap in the camp.
In Auschwitz, I was given a bar of soap every week. Yes, we had soap in Auschwitz.
She also tells you about soap operas, which is how she learned English when she moved here in 1960.
And it was a program called As the World Turns. There were young people holding hands and hugging. And I thought that was interesting. And I became involved with the story. And every day I turned out the television, since we had only one station. That was the only story at that time of the day I could watch. So I thought it must be a very long movie. And I started writing down words that I kept hearing them repeated. So I had a pretty long list of words after a few months. And I didn't know the meanings of the word. So I said to my husband one day, would you help me find these words in the dictionary? He said, where on earth did you get these words from? I said, oh, I have been watching a movie every day. He said, you what? You've been watching soap operas? And he was kind of accusing me. I said, no, there was no soap in it at all. So I learned to speak English a great deal thanks to Bob and Lisa Hughes and As the World Turns.
Do you know how many other Holocaust museums there are in the U.S.?
There's about, don't quote me, but there's about 25 or so actual physical museums. There's a lot more like monuments or something like that, but an actual physical museum, it's in the 20s. So there's not many. Chicago, just north of Chicago in Skokie, Illinois, has the second largest in the United States. Obviously, the United States Holocaust Museum, located in Washington, D.C., which is very impressive if you've not been, is the largest in the United States.
So let's go back to Eva. What was her life like? Where was she at?
Yeah, she was in a really small town called Ports, Romania, and it was herself and her twin sister. They were the youngest. They had two older sisters, and they had a mom and a dad. They lived on a farm in Ports. They were the only Jewish family in this village. Ports is a really small village. The war breaks out in the early 1940s, and the family thought they would be fine. They thought we're the only Jewish family here in this village. They actually hired some village people to work on the farm. And so they had a kind of that perfect childhood where, Eva and her sister, they went through school. They were 10 years old when they did get rounded up by the Gestapo. They were sent to a ghetto for about 6 months, and then they were sent to Auschwitz after that. So they were 10 years old when they went to Auschwitz. And so the first 10 years of her life, they went to school there at Ports, and they worked on the farm. In the farm, they had sheep and goats and chickens and those types of animals that they took care of and did chores every day. Just a really happy, normal life until it was all disrupted one night. And never, obviously everything changed after that.
So let's get into that part. What was that like? She had her parents and her twin sister. Do they all go to Auschwitz at the same time?
Yeah, so they were in, as I mentioned, a ghetto, but the Nazis kind of sold it as a place where you'll be with your same kind of people. All of you will be together. You'll be able to work and live. And it really wasn't the case. A ghetto was basically a holding tank before they were sent to a concentration camp. And Auschwitz was the largest concentration camp. And so Eva and her whole family, again, were at a ghetto where they lived in a tent, according to Eva, made of blankets and other materials for about 6 months. And then they were put on a boxcar, a train, and we had to stand up in this boxcar with they approximately 100 people. They think between 80 and 100 people were in each boxcar. And for 3 days, without any food or water, they were in this boxcar, again, standing up, and traveled to Auschwitz. They didn't know where they were going, but they ended up in Auschwitz. And this was in the summer of 44. And again, they're 10 years old. Eva and her sister are. And they get to Auschwitz. They unload in the boxcar. And there were hundreds of trains. If you go to Auschwitz, they'll tell you there's about the height of the loading and unloading of folks in Auschwitz, about 4,000 people a day were coming through there. And that would have been about the same time that Eva and her family were going through. Again, you're looking at in the summer of 44, and they get off the boxcar. Eva and her sister, twin sister, are holding hands with her mom. And the mom, or a Nazi guard, comes up to the mom and says, "Are they twins?" And the mom said, "Is that a good thing?" And he says, "Yes." So she says yes. And that Nazi guard then grabs the twin girls, Eva and her sister, and drags them away. And that is essentially the last time that Eva sees her mother and then her family as well. And they call it the selection platform after you get off the boxcar. And they call it that because they would have a Nazi doctor or Nazi guard right there, and they would literally select. They would tell you go to the left or to the right, and go to the left meant you were going to go to the work camp. We did have a work camp there at Auschwitz that had thousands of people. But if you were old or frail or pregnant or what have you, they could send you to the right. And to the right meant you were going to go straight to the gas chambers. And they think that's what happened to Eva's mom and dad and her two older sisters. There is no record of them ever being at Auschwitz. And they obviously did not keep many records of those who they sent straight to the gas chambers. And that's exactly what they think happened to Eva's family. And then Eva and Miriam, again, were under the direction and experimented by Dr. Joseph Mengele at their time there in Auschwitz.
How old were their older sisters?
They were 13 and 14 at the time. And again, Eva and her sister were 10, so her older sisters were just 14. So still relatively young. But
what all did she say about after her and her sister were picked from that spot? What all was her memory like from her time at the camp?
Yeah, that's the incredible part is she was, and you can ask her this when online and through the Dimensions and Testimony, she talks about her time. She remembers her first night at the camp, and she remembers going to the latrine in the barrack where they had twins. Twins were separated and in their own kind of barrack, and she went to the latrine, and there were, I think she says, 2 or 3 dead children laying on the floor in the latrine. And the first night that they're there, and she made a vow to herself that she would do everything she could to survive, and she would see that Miriam survived as well. And so she talks about just the brutal conditions that they were under, and how that they were experimented on almost every day. They would have blood drawn. They would be stripped naked and have everything on their body measured and looked at, from their ears to their eyes to their nose. And again, because they were twins, they were able to, that's what the fascination was, especially with Dr. Mengele, was on twins. And they were, Eva and her sister were identical twins. They think, they don't know. Early on in life, you definitely, in early pictures, and even after Auschwitz, you can tell that they were identical. But later in life, they definitely did not look the same. But they were very difficult conditions, obviously, for anyone there at Auschwitz, but especially for young 10-year-old children to go through what they went through it's really amazing.
And being 10 years old, I'm sure they weren't even aware of what type of tests were being done on them.
Yeah, exactly. They were, again, they know they were experimented on. There was a time Eva was injected with something. They don't know what, and because they've never found any records of what Dr. Mengele kept and what experiments he did exactly. But Eva was injected with something and got very sick. She had a fever, and she ended up being put in the hospital there at Auschwitz. And she remembers, and she'll tell you this, that she was Dr. Mengele coming up to her and being surrounded by some other doctors and nurses and saying, "Oh, that's poor child. She only has 2 weeks to live. She's so young. That's too bad." And Eva remembers that, and she tells that story. But she also, again, made a vow that day that she was going to survive. And 2 weeks later, after she had this fever, her fever breaks, and she ends up going back to the barrack and finding Miriam and surviving. But the answer to your question is, yeah, they don't know what experiments were done on them. Different experiments were done on different twins for a variety of reasons. And again, they just have never been able to find any documentation of Dr. Mengele's experiments. So they just really do not know what was done.
You said her twin sister's name is Miriam?
Correct.
So later in life, when Miriam starts having, was it kidney problems?
Yeah.
So when that was happening, they thought that it possibly was related to the tests that were being done at the camp?
Correct, yeah. So it was in the late 80s. They both, Eva and Miriam, had health issues throughout their life, but Miriam seemed to have more issues, and especially, again, in the late 80s, she started having kidney failure, and it was during that process that the doctors found out Miriam's kidneys did not grow past the age 10, which was the age that they were at Auschwitz. So they assume, the doctors, that her experiments were done on Miriam, stunted her kidney growth. And again, in the late 80s, Eva ends up donating a kidney. Eva's kidneys were fine. They ended up donating a kidney to her sister Miriam. And then Miriam would end up passing away a few years later in the early 90s of bladder cancer. And they don't know if that was obviously related to experiments, but yeah, it was. And that's what kind of started the whole Candles Museum. Was the doctors at that time, again, late 80s, they find out that Miriam kidneys are bad, and they said to both Miriam and Eva that, hey, if you could find other twins out there, then maybe we do something. Maybe we could help find out exactly how other twins are, if their kidneys are bad, or what other health issues they may be having. And so that's what Eva, again, and Miriam, they founded Candles at the time to try to locate other twins and to find out if they could find out their medical history, so to speak. And they were able to find 122 twins and talked with them and to find out more about them. But again, we're never able to find out what experiments were done on any of the twins.
Back in Auschwitz, at what point in time did they both start realizing that maybe they were going to be set free?
I don't think it wasn't until the very end. Again, they were liberated in Auschwitz in January 27th of 1945. It's obviously an important date in our history, and we celebrate it here at the museum. The state of Indiana, Governor Holcomb, in the last 3 years, I believe, as January 27th is known as Eva Education Day here in Indiana. And so it's promoted where we talk about Eva's story and tell it. But to answer your question about liberation, is basically liberation meant that the Soviet army came in, and they are the ones who liberated Auschwitz. But that meant basically all the Nazis just left, and they took off, and they burned things, they tore down buildings, they did whatever they can, and then they just left. And so Eva and Miriam, at least Eva would tell us that she just remembered the Nazis she waking up one day and the Nazis were just gone. They were it was very quiet in the camp, and they didn't understand what was going on, and ended up they see soldiers wearing white, and they didn't know what they were, but they knew they weren't Nazis. And so that was a good thing, according to Eva. And they end up giving them hugs and chocolate, I think, were the two things that the Soviet soldiers gave the kids. And I'm guessing others, obviously, there at Auschwitz during liberation.
And While we were walking around the museum, you showed me a video. Can you explain what's happening in the video?
Yeah, so the video was taken shortly after liberation. So just a few days after, again, the January 27th, 1945 date that is known for the liberation. But the Soviets wanted to do a video, basically a propaganda video for them to say, hey, look what we did. We liberated Auschwitz, and which is great. And it's about a 20-minute long video, and you can find it on multiple sites. But if you just look up Auschwitz liberation video, it's on YouTube. It's on the U.S. Holocaust Museum website. But in it is video of Eva and Miriam walking down through barbed wire fences with a group of other twins and other adults who have been liberated. It's just a fascinating moment in time we are able to capture here at the museum. And we obviously show that video. And even Miriam are front and center as they're walking down this corridor of barbed wire fences. And it's just a fascinating, again, video of history for us to be able to keep here at the museum. And we've actually been able to identify other twins that are in this same video, and to be able to connect history like that is pretty cool.
In the very front of the line is Eva and her sister holding hands. I thought that was very powerful too.
Yeah, it really is. We have a large still frame of that video here at the museum, and it's also at the Auschwitz Museum in this exact same still frame of this picture. And yeah, it's Eva and Miriam wearing prisoner jumpsuits, which they did not typically wear. But Eva said that after liberation, again, it was 2 or 3 days after liberation that they actually filmed this video. But during those 2 or 3 days, they would go around the camp, they being Eva and her sister, and try to find clothing to keep them warm. It's January in Poland, so it was pretty cold back then. And so they found these 2 basically male prisoner jackets that they are wearing in the video, and they're holding hands, and it's a pretty powerful moment, like you said.
After liberation, at what point in time did they try to find their family that was also sent to the camp?
Yeah, so it was shortly thereafter. They bounced around a couple different orphanages, and they ended up living with a woman who had twin girls, and that was in Auschwitz, and for a while. Long story, but they end up living with an aunt in Israel. But in Eva's mind, as they were going around a couple different orphanages, that she wanted to get back to Ports, Romania, which is where they grew up. And again, in Eva's mind, she thought, if we survived Auschwitz, because we were 10 years old, surely our mom and dad and our 2 older sisters were able to survive. If we could survive, surely they could. They do make it back to Ports, and they go to the home, and there's nothing there. It's ransacked. Eva would say that there was 2 or 3 photos that were crumpled up on the floor at the house. And we actually have those photos here at the museum. And those are pretty powerful too. They're family photos, basically the last family photos that were taken before they went to the ghetto. But they go back to Ports, and there was, again, nobody there at the house. It's ransacked. And they end up obviously not staying in Ports, but they end up living with an aunt in Israel and going to high school in Israel. And because, again, they're 10, 11, 12 years old at this time that they're in the orphanages. And then they end up going to high school in Israel and joining the Israeli military after high school, which was a requirement, and I believe still is, for all Israelis to, after high school, they have to spend at least 2 years or 3 years in the Israeli military.
At what point in time did they realize their parents and their sisters may not have survived?
Yeah, I think Eva would say it was when, again, they went home, and it was ransacked and there was nobody there, because it had been a few months after liberation before they were able to make it back home. And I think she would say, and I think she does in the Dimensions and Testimony, that it was at that point that she realized that they would not be coming home.
In the next episode, we're going to reconnect with Eva for the rest of her story. Troy will walk us through her post-war life, as well as the mission and purpose of this museum, which is to offer hope and shed light on other forms of injustice in the world today.